I can't break through to people that 18% of the country elects 52 senators. Right? We have to get more votes. We have 50 United States senators. We have a 4-vote majority in the Democratic House of Representatives. We should have won this election huge. And we come across as just condescending to people. It's thinking that, and I know out here, Democrats out in the rest of the country feel like that they are being talked down to.
Veteran Democratic strategist James Carville says that the Democratic Party has a wokeness problem. He told Vox this week that Dems have to stop using what he calls too cool for school jargon when it comes to race, or risk losing their narrow advantage on Capitol Hill and perhaps in the White House. Joining me now, political contributor, MSNBC political contributor Jason Johnson, and the executive director of Next Gen America, Christina Sensoon Ramirez. Thank you both for being here. Jason, I actually want to start with you on this because I may lose my amen corner here, but I encourage people to read that entire Vox interview with James Carville. He said a lot. Jason, I have to say, some of the things he said, at first I was like, oh, this is, a white man trying to appeal to the mass white people, but he actually got into some communities of color and made some legitimate points. I'm curious your thoughts on this whole wokeness debate.
Well, look, I think it's overwrought. Right. And look, James Carville is a very, very smart guy, a very successful guy. I remember reading his books back in college, him and Paul Begala. So this isn't meant to say that he somehow lost touch with what the American people want. But I do think that the idea of wokeness as being a problem mistakes what wokeness means. And I think Democrats can create their own difficulties by sort of categorizing these people as this out-of-touch liberal elite. Yes, if you start talking too much about issues of sexuality and bathrooms and things like that, there are lots of different people who don't care about those kinds of issues. There's lots of black people and Hispanic people and Asian people who may not care about those particular issues. But then again, I don't know many Democrats that have made those kinds of issues the tip of the spear of their campaign messaging. Yes, if you talk too much about Black Lives Matter or defund the police, you would obviously offend lots of different people, not just white people, but black people and brown people. But I don't know any Democrats that are actually running with those as their main campaign points. So the problem that I see here is not so much that James Carville is wrong on the result. Yes, if these issues are the focus, there are some voters that you want to attract. But no Democrats are really talking about these things as their main issues. So it seems ridiculous to me that that's a worry for Dems, since that's not where the vast majority of the party stands.
Christina, do you think Jason has a point? And I should say that we did invite James Carville here today to discuss this, but he was not available. But I look forward to having him on the show soon. But do you think Jason has a point? Because Democrats have talked about things like abolish the police, and there is something that he referenced, the political correctness of using terms like Latinx. He says, look, I talk to a lot of people in the Latino community who don't use that term. I'm curious your take on it.
Well, you can call me Latina, Hispanic, or Latinx. I don't care. What I care is what you deliver to my community. And I think that's what a lot of voters care about. But I want to be, I think Alicia Garza, my friend, puts it best, that for those that are woke, we have to invite people in and create space for people that are awakening as well. I don't think the left is the problem. What I think the problem are a few wealthy donors that for years paid politicians to go around and tell us that immigrants, people of color, queer folks, and the poor were to blame for all the problems we faced. I believe that most Americans want the progressive agenda that we all agree on, that healthcare should be an American right, that we should have a living wage, not a minimum wage, and we should invest in our schools and our kids by taxing the rich their fair share. I've spent 20 years organizing on the ground here in Texas, construction workers, immigrant moms, and young voters. And I can tell you from organizing in Texas, what I learned is that there is no lefty choir to preach to. There are only non-believers to convert. And I have loved doing this work, and I've done it as an unequivocal progressive that has always stood up for the rights of the undocumented and the LGBTQ. But I've learned how to listen to people that think differently than me, that don't always share my same perspective. And we win as progressives when we invite people in. And that at the end of the day, when we can see our common values and not necessarily push people out based on who they voted for or on every single issue to make sure that they agree with us, we win, because prolonged division between progressives and others only benefits the rich and powerful that gain further access and influence over our political and economic systems when we can't see our common values.
Jason, I think some of this might be generational, right? I think there is a racial divide, but there's also a generational divide. I think the racial divide is, white people are not used to being centered. There are a lot of white people who feel like, oh, but you're talking too much about these other groups, and perhaps I feel left out. Then there's a generational divide of people who get nervous when you make white people uncomfortable. And I think some of this conversation involves that. You're asking for these things. We're voting based on how other people vote. Where do you stand on this big tent party trying to corral all these people together and kind of, I guess, squash the infighting that we see sometimes?
So here's the thing. This is where I clearly disagree with James Carville. This is that pie. I mean, look, I'm a college professor, but this is what I would call ivory tower, DC chatter kind of conversations. Because I lived in the same Ohio and the same Midwestern people that he's talking about. Regular people are not hearing this kind of messaging from their members of Congress. Do you think Sherrod Brown is talking about, trans young women trying to play football? No. Sherrod Brown is talking about a $15 minimum wage. You think Carolyn Bordeaux, right, who was attacked as a Black Lives Matter activist in Georgia 7th District, where her opponent said, oh, my God, she's a radical, she's going to defund the police. And she's like, no, I'm not. But I did march with people because I think that the killing of unarmed black people by police is wrong. And she won her seat, one of the few places that Democrats actually picked up in the 2020 elections. This is not what people are hearing at the local level. And that's why it's a problem, because you've got national Democrats and national talking heads saying this is a problem. This is a problem. And then they seep that down to voters, and the voters are like, oh, is that what we're hearing from Democrats? Because it's not. And that's the issue. And I think your other guest said this very well, and I think this is important to understand. In the attempt to make sure that you're not going too woke, that you offend people, you also have to remember that woke people vote too, black people vote too, trans people vote too, gay people vote too, and you can't completely dismiss those issues, because that is your new generation of voters that also are going to be necessary for you to flip states like Georgia and for you to be competitive in states like Texas.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because you guys remember after the election, there was some reporting that the more conservative, moderate members of the party were mad at the progressives because they had a hard time running in their districts. And it was quite offensive, to be honest. So when it does come to those national politics, and I take your point, Jason, Christina, how do you think people should navigate this on the ground when their constituents are saying, hey, I'm nervous about, abolish the police, or I don't support that? I mean, we have to be inclusive, because to Jason's point, woke people vote too. I'd consider myself a woke voter. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, the values, people share them, and it's up to politicians to explain that. When people were talking about, we want more investment in our schools, in our communities, in our healthcare than in policing, most voters agree with that. And so really politicians have to do the work, elected officials, of explaining what people are demanding. I'm almost 40, and I remember when Democrats would throw undocumented immigrants under the bus, when they wouldn't stand up for the LGBTQ community, when they weren't on the right side of criminal justice. And we have moved the party to the right direction, and we are actually winning elections. That is the point.
Right.
We have the presidency, we have the Senate, we have the House. What we need to do is show people why there's a vested interest for everyone on these issues. And I do think words matter. Yeah. We need to be able to show why what we stand for benefits everyone.
Right. Yeah, and a reminder, the people define the party. The party does not define the people. So Jason Johnson is sticking around for the next hour. Thank you so much, Christina Sunsoon Ramirez.